Michelle King, welcome to The Engaging Leader.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Michelle, you recently joined Netflix as the Director of Inclusion after several years at UN Women. Why was that the right next step for you in your life's work?
Yeah, so my role at UN Women was sort of overseeing our work in innovation and tech. I worked with a number of private sector partners, everybody from LinkedIn to Facebook to GE. And we really looked at sort of industry-wide how we can tackle gender inequality and what sort of programs we can put in place to try and remove some of the barriers women and girls face in the industry. And so we had some incredible initiatives that came out of that. And it really just made sense in terms of my next step to pick an organization and try and sort of, implement some of that learning that I sort of received through my PhD and work on the book, into an organization. So that's really, what the thinking was in terms of why the role, but specifically Netflix because the organization has an incredible culture, and I saw it as a great opportunity to be able to apply some of this work. Often in the diversity inclusion space, you have to convince companies to even listen to you, whereas Netflix is sort of leading the way in this, in a lot of respects in terms of being super open to it and really keen to apply a lot of it. So again, just saw it as an opportunity to partner with an incredible organization and apply some of what I had learned and was currently doing at the UN.
There's been a lot of discussion around gender equality at work and what women can do to help themselves. But you argue we need to stop trying to fix women and start fixing workplaces. What's wrong with the current approach?
Yeah, so current approaches, I think are really the solutions tell you a lot about what people think the problem are. So if you look at sort of how we're approaching inequality to date, and I was part of this. So from a range of D&I initiatives, you have mentoring, you have sort of networking, you have leadership development programs, you have initiatives to try and help women speak up more and negotiate more, and there's just a range of programs out there, and all of them center around this idea that somehow if we tweak women or fix women, they'll be able to fit into the system a bit better, right? So if women do a bit more, change how they approach things, they'll be able to work within organizations in advance. And that's simply not the case. Lean In came out 10 years ago now, and the message based on that book was very much this line of thinking. And I bought into it, so when the book first came out, I was like, oh, this is great. But it wasn't until I started looking at the academic research that's been in the space around women in organizations for the last sort of 20, 30 years that I really started to see, hey, actually, these issues have been around forever. They're not going away, and no amount of fixing women is going to solve this. I mean, we even saw in the 90s with power dressing, right? Like women are literally changing how they look to try and fit into the system. And it occurred to me in the literature that actually maybe it's the system that needs fixing. So that's why I started looking. But I only started looking there when I found research that showed how truly remarkable women were. And a lot of that surprised me. So typical things like networking, it's one of the things we know so well, right? Networking comes up all the time. Women are not great networkers. They need to network more. That's why they're not receiving the career opportunities. And that's simply not the case. I found study after study that shows men and women rate women as higher in terms of their networking ability. It's not that women can't network. It's that networks don't work in the same way for women and men. So, even if women network, they're unlikely to receive the same benefit because men aren't supporting them in the same way. And so understanding how that works and solving for that is much more effective than sort of sending women on another networking course. And I think, I just really struggle that sort of collective problems that we all have a hand in creating, we're putting down to individuals to try and solve. No amount of me trying to tackle inequality on my own is ever going to solve it unless my organization's on board and they're playing a hand in it too. So I don't ever try and ask women to do anything that I wouldn't get men to do.
Well, speaking of getting men to do, a lot of your book, in addition to providing business case for inclusion and equality at work, talks about and how it's so beneficial to organizations and their bottom line to do so, which makes total sense and has for a long time. I was really caught by surprise at your arguments about how much better it can be for men if there was greater equality at work. Can you tell us about that? In other words, it's a win-win for men and women.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I'm married to a white middle class, what I refer to in my book as the Don Draper prototype. So I'm actually married to that. And my husband would be the first to admit that he never signed up to become a feminist, probably wouldn't have described himself as a feminist. And so he's gone on this feminism journey with me. And I've educated him along the way. And I really tell the story through some of his eyes, and seeing the challenges that he faces at work. And I have a very real example of when this hit home for me, when my son was sick and I was leaving to go to work at the UN. And I'll never forget, my husband turned around, he said, and he was really panicked. He had sort of this white faced look, and he was like, Michelle, what am I going to tell my boss? And he was trying to get me, enroll me in lying, basically. And I was so confused, and I didn't understand, and I kind of got irritated. I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, I can't tell him that I'm taking our son to the doctor. And it was at that moment when I was like, oh wow, you're somebody who succeeded based on the system. You're the prototype, not necessarily always in terms of the negative behaviors, but certainly in terms of he aligns himself with the prototype. The system works for him, so he doesn't understand how it doesn't always work for everybody else in the same way. And yet here he was struggling with a very basic human need of being able to be honest. And he was saying, I just can't tell my boss that because I'll be seen as kind of a less than. And so I put my bag down. I rang my boss, told her I was going to be late. And I sat down with my husband and literally schooled him on, hey, this is why this matters. Because when you don't speak up, it makes it harder for me to speak up. And if you think it's hard and you fit the prototype and you're succeeding in this organization, imagine how much harder it is for other women. And so, that started my journey of becoming aware that we think we can solve inequality by speaking to women, but actually most of our work actually lies with men. And so, an author that I always talk about is Liz Plank. She wrote a book, For the Love of Men, and it purely focuses on this idea that the current system doesn't work for men, and she looks at it more holistically. I specifically focus on workplaces, but it is interesting in my work in researching the barriers women face. I made the assumption, most of us do, that the system works for men, and it just doesn't. So things like, one of the ways that men best align with this ideal standard in organizations that is masculine in order to be seen as a leader is through silence, is through bullying, is through denying sort of their lives outside of home, is through engaging in exclusionary behaviors or remaining silent when male colleagues kind of engage in some sexist banter, even if it's just joking. So men have a really hard time because they can't speak about any of this stuff, but they're experiencing it as much as women. And some studies have found that in environments that are unequal, men dislike them just as much as women, but they feel like they can't really speak up as much. And so that's the challenge, is I think unpacking male silence, because silence is a form of being complicit in the system. And so I think it's how do we first call it out? So simply just make men aware of the challenges this creates for them. It's very hard for them to develop identities outside of work. They have to live up to the breadwinner image. They have to engage in behaviors that really only work for a very small percentage of the population. And they have to do all of that to access leadership opportunities, just like women do. But that creates a lot of challenges for men, and increasingly so as we're seeing men wanting lives outside of work. They want to be, dads are a bit more hands-on. They want that life, but you're penalized when you do it. So it's how do you create an environment where men can be themselves? And, I think the biggest thing men can start to is just speaking up. It's such a simple thing, but it is. If you have to take your son to the doctor, letting everybody in the office know that you're doing that and starting to speak up, because that's the way you make it easier for everybody else to, and particularly leaders. I hate putting that on sort of individuals. I think for leaders, that's, male leaders, the number one thing they can do is start talking about their lives outside of work and giving people the freedom to kind of show up differently. I think that's a really important action people can take.
One of the things you talk about it being important to speak about at work is the gender denial, and that denying that is the greatest barrier to women's advancement at work. Can you tell us about that and how we can overcome it?
So I was fascinated by this, and I'm still fascinated by it, because I would sit in my PhD interviews with senior leaders, right, in 2 different organizations, 2 different countries, so nothing in common, right, completely different organizations, and some women, but mostly men. And I would say, hey, why do you think we've got so few women in leadership? What are some of the barriers you think women face, or why is it, that this is happening? And leaders would consistently say to me, Michelle, our workplace is a meritocracy. Women don't face any additional barriers. We treat everybody the same. So everybody in effect is the same. and this was really odd. Like, these are workplaces where I think across the board, they had about 8% of women in leadership positions. So, when I would bring that up, I would then be met with the same rhetoric of it's a meritocracy. And I found it really hard to understand this denial. And it was consistent. So it was consistent in both data sets. And so when I went back into the literature to try and understand what was happening, and I was super frustrated because I was hoping they'd be like, these are the barriers. And so it'd be really clear. I realized that this is actually the biggest barrier. So the biggest barrier is actually the denial, this belief that workplaces are meritocracies. The biggest message in my book is that, hey, success discriminates. And success discriminates because work environments were never designed for difference. They were never designed, when we originally started organizations back in when Henry Ford was first coming up with how workplaces should work and what it takes to lead and what a manager's role is, that original thinking, Taylorism and some of those initial ideas. It was designed for men. It was a workplace designed for white middle-class men, and was a very white workplace with that kind of logic behind it. So workplaces were never created with women in mind. And we know that because you see sort of maternity policies today sort of plastered on top like an afterthought, just like women are, right? Like, oh, we're just going to plaster on this policy or this flexible work scheme into a system that actually doesn't facilitate that. So you can have all the policies in the world, but if leaders aren't taking flexible work, nobody else is going to, because people want to lead one day, and so they're copying what leaders do. So I think, a lot of it really kind of centers on that idea of thinking through how our workplaces don't work for everybody in the same way and disrupting our denial around that. And, I've been struggling a lot with this recently in my own work, because there's this bias towards action. So when people read my book, they want Michelle, what are the 5 things I can go away and do, right? And the thing about denial is and particularly in Western cultures, we have a hard time with this, is that the work is awareness. Like, that's my message to people. Your work is awareness. So your work is becoming aware of how things don't work in the same way for everybody. Because once you're aware, you can sort of deepen your understanding and start thinking about how you can make it a practice when situations show up. There's no action list I can give you that's going to prepare you for every single situation in your environment. But when a colleague comments on, women's appearance or a woman's body, or when a colleague makes a racist comment or borderline, and sometimes they're subtle, right? Like modern sexism, this idea, it's a lot more subtle. It's a lot more covert. It's in those moments that if you don't have the awareness, it's much harder to recognize those things for what they are, and then it's much harder to speak up or take action. The actions are really simple. 9 times out of 10, it's calling it out or taking action or advocating for somebody. But it's, I think, the awareness bit, and people struggle with that because that's the work. And so, we all have an obligation to disrupt our own denial. I had to disrupt it when it comes to women of color, and I've also had to disrupt it when it comes to men, and understanding the challenges we all face. But I think each of us has our work to do in understanding that.
You say, well, it's really it's that the answers or steps are really easy. You create awareness and then you speak up when you see it. But I guess I can just think of all the things that can go wrong when you try to speak up. Where does a person turn to get, like, even just how would you say, if you see some, let's say, sexual harassment happening, or someone makes, especially one of those subtler comments that, you could call them on it and then they're like, well, I was just joking. And how do you say things like that in a way that is maybe gentle and assuming good intent and can influence them to make the right choices going forward?
Yeah, so I don't mean to, for people who are listening to this, I don't mean to come across in the way that's, dismissive of how hard this work is. It is hard, right? So I think what I mean is easy is the hardest bit is actually the awareness bit. So once you have some of the awareness, for example, I know through my work and through the book that for Black women in particular, there's an angry Black woman stereotype, right? So when leaders say, hey, you need to speak up more in meetings, or hey, you need to do this, I can protect my colleague by saying, well, it's not that easy for her, and here's why, because of this. So I think the awareness somehow informs the action. And I think the awareness is easy because that's work you do on your own. So there's this tendency to want people to kind of spoon feed us our education. Selfishly, my book is a great place to start with that. So reading the book kind of disrupts your denial, and you start to learn about the barriers and you create that understanding. I think the action is really, when it comes to speaking up, we're really asking people to practice allyship. So that means, making awareness kind of an ongoing process, making it your job to learn about the barriers. Those are two big things you have to do to earn your seat at the table of allyship, right? You have to kind of demonstrate you're making that commitment. But once you've done that, the speaking up bit is in very real examples. It's as simple as calling out the barriers when it happens. So for example, my husband was in a meeting with a colleague, and one of his colleagues mentioned a woman's sort of physical, her breast. He was talking about the size of her breast. I can barely say it because it makes me so mad. And
Yeah, makes you cringe.
And my husband just turned to him and he said in the moment, "Hey, that's not cool." And he got up and left. And he came home and he goes, "Do you think that was the right thing to do?" And in that moment, I said to him, "You reset the norms, because just by saying it's not cool, you reset the norms within that guy's mind around what's acceptable and what's not." He might not go, he might never change, but you disrupted a little bit of his sense of what's normal, and you made it okay to speak up in that moment, and anyone witnessing that would have. So I think sometimes it's as simple as that, and other times it's also when you're seeing something that you think could be fairly, just simply asking why. I talk about this in the book a lot. So my husband had a colleague as well who was being considered for a senior role, but she was probably going to have a baby, and so her work kind of made this decision that she wouldn't be right. She was planning on having a family. And my husband just asked why. So in the meeting, he's like, "Why?" And what that does is it forces the other person to kind of call out their own racism or sexism in the minute. And he did this, and it was quite effective. I mean, she got promoted off the back of it, because in digging through, he was like, "Well, she might have a baby." And so my husband's like, "Yes, but why? People can have a baby and be a leader." And so then that forced them to sort of adjust, and it's uncomfortable in the moment, but I think the biggest difficulty is people don't want to lean into the discomfort. And I always say, if you're feeling uncomfortable, you're doing the work. Like, it's when we're sitting there and it's all comfortable and, just your standard unconscious bias training, and it's my worst, always pick on it. But, that's not good enough. Like, we need people to feel uncomfortable. And if you're feeling uncomfortable, wondering if you should take action, you're probably on the right path. So speak up.
Yeah, that's really inspiring. Michelle, where can people find out more about you and your work and your book? And by the way, the name of the book again is The Fix: Overcome the Invisible Barriers That Are Holding Women Back at Work.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you saying that. They can find more sort of information. I've got a website. We're redoing it. We're relaunching it in a week's time. There'll be instructional videos on there. There's a lot of content going to be posted on there. I've also got a podcast, a weekly podcast called The Fix. It's out every Monday. It's available where all podcasts are available. So, and on that, I actually try and tackle some of these topics in a much smaller format, sort of easily digestible, 15 minutes. And every week there's a fix. So there's something you can do and apply in your workplace. But I would say outside of me, there's a bunch of really good resources, amazing books and authors. Like, for white women in particular, we've really got to start educating ourselves. So there are authors out there like Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, more recent authors like Reniero Lodge. You've got my favorite, Brittany Cooper, women who are sharing their experiences as women of color. And I think irrespective of where you live, like, this is a really important thing that we need to do, really understanding those experiences, because that's how we reach everybody. When you account for race, you account for gender, you account for ability, really educating yourselves on some of those differences. So I think I would encourage people to think outside of even me. I'm just a starting point. And in my book, in the reference list, you can see all the different authors and journals that I reference. And I think that's a good point to pick up on.
Michelle King, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining us on Engaging
No
Leaders.
worries. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.